say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming?
You know what to do. Kill them all.
When we have a sequel such as The Division 2 in development, we have preconceptions about what that game should be, whether they be positive or negative, what it should offer in content, how will it play, and in terms of looter shooters, how long can we expect to play this for? With the first Division game, gamers were presented with one that had several issues at launch, both technical and content related, but the game also offered a lot to enjoy. First and foremost was the section of New York City that had been created, a snow-covered environment that gave the game a definitive look and a memorable game space to play in. Missions were fun, as was the gunplay, but it would take the developer of Massive Entertainment months and years to add technical updates and content drops that would see the game end up being more of what players were after. The hopes were that the developer and Ubisoft would take how the first game ended up and begin the sequel with that level of understanding and polish, with a large depth of content, a proper endgame, and to expand on what that first game had. With The Division 2, Massive Entertainment has shown that they have learned from their first looter shooter outing, taken that experience and implemented as best they can to release a sequel that is rich on content at launch with as few bugs as possible in a new, open world that players want to explore. I'll say it early in this review though that Ubisoft shouldn't be commended for releasing a full game that feels finished as much as these games can be at launch. Gamers should expect games to be like this when they pay for them. Now in saying that, it is good to see Ubisoft foster this attitude for Massive Entertainment to go on and create this sequel we now have, but this should be common practice within the gaming industry. Not having played the first Division game until early last year, I had a great time with it, but could see the areas I wanted the sequel to improve upon, seeing what it got right, whilst what needed to be added or changed for the Division franchise to take the next step and perhaps be the pinnacle of the looter shooter. The Division 2 has taken over the majority of my playtime from Destiny 2 and Anthem, and when comparing them all, it's interesting to see where they are all so different, but also what the Division 2 has gotten so right that really pushes these sorts of games forward. The Division 2 is a complete game. I'm not saying it's a perfect game, nor am I saying that some tweaks and bug fixes aren't still needed. But overall, the quality of this game is a great foundation on which to release future content. The Division 2 takes what makes the first game enjoyable, what makes Tom Clancy so popular, plus the lessons learned from Rainbow Six Siege, and crafts a looter shooter that deserves success and should be called out for just how much this offers.
You are now entering a safe area.
This review will be from the standpoint of a mostly solo player and what the game offers to those who won't be teaming up with others. Does the game deliver what solo players are after, and does it offer enough to keep their interest over dozens of hours of playtime? The answer to these questions is an undeniable yes, but let's start with the story. Depending on how proficient you are at the game, most players will finish the main campaign in around 30 to 40 hours, and this will see players move their way around Washington DC, completing missions in various landmarks that exist within the city. There are cutscenes mixed in between the missions, which helps the story move forward, and by giving a little more backstory or personalities to the NPCs that players will be interacting with. But overall, I'd be surprised if you remember what their names were and who they were exactly, as the game never really hits any high points or complexity in regards to its story, its characters, or your relationship with them. With the city on the brink of collapse due to its lawlessness and the different criminal factions which exist within it, it is up to players to take the city back 7 months after the initial outbreak of the virus in New York from the first game. The main story is somewhat simple and doesn't delve into any deep themes, opinions or history which could have been explored, since the game is set in such an iconic city of the United States and home to a major part of its political system. For those who watched my Anthem review, I never put too much importance on the main stories within a looter shooter, as there is far more important parts of the game that make the games a success. So, the story is quite average, characters aren't really all that fleshed out, and it will probably be forgotten the moment it's over, but The Division 2 delivers some fantastic missions to participate in. Each has an incredible level of detail, and there always seems to be an urgency to the situation which makes you feel what you're doing is important. This is helped by the graphical detail and AI of the enemies, which I'll get to later, but the missions are just so enjoyable to play, and each seems to offer something a little different than the others to keep things interesting. And that's even when the developers are throwing out the same old tired formulas at you as all looter shooters do. Cleverly disguised, up-tempo action sequences that are really nothing more than a horde mode where players are tasked to defend a certain position and where enemies seemingly run out of nowhere, then onto an even more powerful enemy which must be defeated for the sequence or mission to end. Nothing new here, but I had such a great time playing through them, even though it was nothing new. Switching weapons, using the abilities and cover system, it all gels together so well, and that brings me to perhaps the greatest change from the first game, and that's the gameplay and the gunplay. Although feeling familiar and looking almost identical to those who perhaps haven't played both games, the shooting in The Division 2 just feels so damn good. It's a more refined version of the original, but it feels much more responsive, and the weapons have a more natural feel to them, which makes them incredibly satisfying to use. And this is needed, especially when playing solo, and with such aggressive AI enemies which try and smoke you out of cover or flank you from different directions. Each gun and gun type have different characteristics, of course, and I found myself favouring different weapons over others, especially when it came to the different kinds of scopes, as well as their zoom, the recoil patterns, magazine size, and just the overall feeling that I had with certain guns. Trying to give yourself the best vantage of the surrounding environment as enemies move towards you mean the difference between life and death. Choosing a position where you are in control of any given situation whilst using the gear and items at your disposal makes the gameplay so enjoyable. There were a few times when moving from cover to cover or trying to get behind a barricade was more difficult than it needed to be, but overall the cover system works very well. But it's also great using the cover without actually crouching or standing behind it, just using it enough while standing to quickly pop out to fire off some shots and then move back in. Using all weapons, items and the cover system all work together to overcome the different enemy types and their aggressiveness towards you. Roaming the streets will see you come across enemy groups who, once they know you're there, will charge at you, dive behind the nearest cover or start shooting at you. Preparing before the gunfight is always in your interest, especially if other enemies nearby become part of the firefight. All of this becomes even more important once we start doing the side missions and activities that the Division 2 presents the player with. Side missions are of a high standard throughout the game, and you could easily mistake them for main missions as they are a decent length and often just as interesting. Once again, they don't throw anything hugely original at you, but they are all enjoyable and offer differences even though you are doing the same actions repeatedly. Move to an area, investigate the surroundings, kill the enemies, and then move on. All standard, but all enjoyable, and then we have the control points that are scattered around the map. I'll talk about these again in part 2 discussing the endgame, but these control points really add to the feel of the world as they are certain spots that enemy factions have seized control of. Players are tasked with retaining these areas and will contend with a number of enemies. Once all the enemies are killed, and usually ending with a yellow bar enemy, then the control point has been taken back. Players can also shoot a flare to have AI allies move in to help them take the control point, which is important for solo players. Once captured, donating materials, food and water will give the players XP, and the area can now be fast travelled to. Searching these complexes is also a good idea, as resources and weapons can also be found, which is especially helpful when leveling up at the beginning of the game. And then we also have settlements that players can visit and help out, and this makes scavenging the world for resources, gear and other items much more meaningful, as it feels like you are helping those who call the settlement home. And once again, it just makes the world feel more alive. With several of these scattered around the map, they are also a source of acquiring side missions and taking on the projects that are offered. These allow players to help the settlements out by donating resources and materials, weapons, armor and other gear, and these are a fantastic way of gaining XP as well, to increase in level, but also makes exploring the world much more important. It also means simply selling your unwanted gear is not the only option, as you may wish to hang on to it as a certain project may be in need of it. And now that we're talking about the gear and items, how is the loot part of the Division 2? If you watch my other recent videos discussing looter shooters such as Anthem and Destiny 2, you would have heard me discuss that there is a fine line that developers must try and get right in these games, and that's the area of rewarding players enough so they feel they've accomplished something in the playtime and that their time is respected. But then you also don't want to be showered in so much loot that the rewards seem somewhat meaningless or players become indifferent to receiving them. And then there is also the issue of making sure that that loot, whether given a lot or not, is actually worth having and worth grinding for. So far, the Division 2 has done a good job in this area, as during each play session I am acquiring higher level loot drops, which is important, but there was also other times when leveling between the levels of 20 and 30 where I was still receiving many rare loot drops, which made the rewards of superior or higher that much more satisfying. Receiving loot from defeated enemies, completing main and side missions, or leveling up gives players several ways to earn this loot as well. The depth that the Division 2 has with the roles that weapons or items come with also gives the game more diversity in its loot than a game such as Anthem, where the loot table is quite small. Being able to see the stats on a weapon or item and the perks it has, and then compare it to another, gives players more freedom in the loadouts they choose and the builds they are trying to go for, and this is where I enjoy the Division 2 so much. Instead of dumbing down the RPG elements to make the game more accessible to more gamers, it wants to offer as much as it can, but then leaves players to discover things at their own pace and on their own, and this has a whole new meaning once players reach the end game, which I'll discuss in part 2 of this review. But often I would find myself using gear and items that may have been 1 or 2 levels below my overall level, but wanted a specific perk attached to that particular item. Being able to customize the gear through mods just adds more depth to the game, and I do wish there was more cosmetic customization for your character and weapons, as even with dozens of hours of playtime, there needs to be more options when it comes to getting the look of your character how you want. Weapon skins and clothing options can be found by exploring the world, and your player character's appearance can be changed, but even changing your character's appearance in-game needs more variety in the options. Further customization can be had with the crafting system, which players can use as well. Whilst playing, you will be rewarded with blueprints, which you can then make once the crafting table is unlocked. Once these blueprints are received, the materials are then needed, but being able to craft is something that is more important once you hit the end game, as simply playing the game and leveling up will see players be rewarded enough and continue to rank up. Now, throughout my playtime, I didn't experience much in the way of technical issues, besides only once where the game froze and needed to be restarted. Server issues or any type of lag or connection problems were non-existent during my playtime, and it was a great experience, especially after all the problems that I encountered whilst playing Anthem. From a graphics perspective, the game looks fantastic, as does the lighting. Perhaps the only downside to the graphics would be that the pop-up is noticeable, and there are some very slow loading textures sometimes, which would see very low resolution versions in view until the much higher quality image is loaded in. Overall, playing this game primarily as a solo player is still very enjoyable and provides enough content to keep players busy for many hours. Should a solo player find some missions a little difficult and need help, then the game can matchmake you with other players, even during a mission if you happen to die. I did find this a bit hit or miss when trying to find help though, as sometimes a player would join quite quickly, whilst other times I would be waiting 10 or 20 minutes with no luck. This is an option within the game as to whether you wish to be notified of other players needing help, so unless people are turning the option off or simply not responding is unknown. The Division 2 is a great sequel to a game that eventually found its groove as time went on. Ubisoft and the developers have built upon the original game, and it's a much better game at that, especially at launch. It's great to see a large AAA game get released with so much content and mostly live up to the expectations that fans of the first game have. In part 2 of the review, I will delve into the endgame and what that offers, how the base game is transformed, and the sheer amount of content and changes that Massive Entertainment have included. When there have been several disappointing launches for looter shooters over the years, it's great to see a game do justice to the genre. The Division 2 is the new benchmark for what gamers need to expect from these games upon release.